The summer of 1877 turned the Texas borderlands into a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Captain James "Iron Jim" Caldwell stood on the ramparts of Fort Stockton, watching dust devils dance across the desert floor. Behind him, the flag snapped in the hot wind like a whip crack. "They're coming, Captain," said Sergeant Miguel Santos, his weathered face grim. "My scouts say at least 200 Comancheros, armed to the teeth. And they've got something else, former Confederate cavalry riding with them." Caldwell's jaw tightened. The war had been over for 12 years, but out here on the frontier, old hatreds died hard. The Comancheros, that dangerous mix of Mexican bandits, renegade Comanches, and white outlaws, had been raiding settlements for months. But Confederate riders? That changed everything. How long do we have? 2 days. Maybe 3. Fort Stockton held barely 80 men, most of them green recruits who'd never fired a shot in anger. The nearest reinforcements were at Fort Davis, 5 days' hard ride away. Caldwell turned to face his sergeant. "Send riders to every ranch, every settlement within 20 miles. Every man who can hold a rifle needs to be here by tomorrow nightfall. We're going to make a stand." By the next evening, the fort's population had swelled to nearly 150 souls. Ranchers arrived with their hired hands. A group of Mexican vaqueros rode in, led by Don Alejandro Cordova, whose family had lost everything to Comanchero raids. Even a band of former buffalo hunters, hard men with Sharps rifles, answered the call. The most surprising arrival came just before sunset. "Captain Caldwell," the sentry's voice rang out. "You're going to want to see this." Through the gates rode 30 Tonkawa warriors, their horses painted for war. At their head rode Chief Running Wolf, who'd served as a scout for the army years before. "The Comancheros killed my son last moon," Running Wolf said, his English perfect and cold as winter steel. "They burned a Tonkawa village to the ground. We share an enemy, Captain. Let us share this fight." Caldwell clasped the chief's forearm. "Welcome, old friend. We'll need every gun." That night, strange alliances formed around campfires. Union soldiers shared coffee with Confederate veterans. Anglo ranchers planned tactics with Mexican vaqueros. Tonkawa warriors sharpened their knives beside buffalo hunters. Don Alejandro approached Caldwell as he walked the perimeter. "My grandfather fought at the Alamo, Captain. He always said the frontier doesn't care about the color of your skin or which flag you salute. Out here, there's only the living and the dead. Wise man. Your grandfather." He also said the living plan better than the dead. Don Alejandro unrolled a map. "I know this country. I know where they'll come from. And I know how we can bloody them before they even reach the walls." The Comanchero army appeared at dawn, a massive cloud of dust on the horizon. At their head rode Rattlesnake, Jack Morrison, a former Confederate colonel who'd refused to surrender, and his partner, the half-Comanche outlaw known only as El Escorpion. Morrison raised his hand, halting the column. Something wasn't right. The fort should have sent out scouts, fired warning shots. Instead, silence. "It's a trap." El Escorpion growled. "Of course it's a trap," Morrison snapped. "But they've got maybe 100 men against our 200. They're desperate, not clever. We'll ride through whatever they've planned and string up that Yankee captain by sunset." They advanced toward the narrow canyon that led to the fort. Perfect ambush country, but Morrison had numbers on his side. What could they possibly? The first explosion shattered the morning stillness. Don Alejandro's men had spent all night placing dynamite charges along the canyon walls. As the Comanchero column entered the narrows, Caldwell gave the signal. Tons of rock crashed down, cutting the force in half and crushing dozens beneath the rubble. From the canyon rim, the Tonkawa warriors and buffalo hunters opened fire with their long rifles. Men fell from their saddles, never knowing what hit them. "Fall back! Fall back!" Morrison screamed, but the chaos was total. The Comancheros broke and ran, leaving 40 dead in the canyon. But they were far from defeated. For 3 days, the Comancheros besieged Fort Stockton. They had numbers, but the defenders had walls and determination. Morrison proved to be a cunning tactician. He kept up constant harassing fire, preventing anyone from sleeping. He sent small raiding parties to test the defenses, probing for weaknesses. He cut off the fort's water supply, forcing the defenders to rely on their limited wells. On the second night, El Escorpión led a group of Comanche warriors in a silent assault on the north wall. They nearly made it inside before Sergeant Santos and his men counterattacked with bayonets in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Santos took a knife wound to the shoulder, but personally threw El Escorpión from the wall. The outlaw landed badly, his leg broken. His men dragged him away into the darkness. Inside the fort, ammunition ran low. The heat was unbearable. Men fought on despite wounds that should have sent them to bed. "We can't hold another day," one of the ranchers said during a council of war. "We're down to 40 rounds per man." "Then we make every shot count," Caldwell replied. Running Wolf spoke up. "Or we change the game. They expect us to hide behind walls. What if we don't?" At first light on the fourth day, Rattlesnake Jack Morrison prepared for the final assault. His men were tired, but the fort had to be on its last legs. One more push would do it. Then the gates opened. Captain Caldwell led the charge himself, riding at the head of every man who could still fight. Union cavalry, Confederate veterans, vaqueros, ranchers, buffalo hunters, and Tonkawa warriors, all riding together in one desperate, magnificent charge. Morrison's men, expecting a defensive siege, were caught completely off guard. The two forces collided in a thunderous crash of gunfire, steel, and fury. Caldwell found himself face to face with Morrison, the two officers exchanging pistol shots at point-blank range before their horses crashed together. Don Alejandro and his vaqueros swept the Comanchero flank, their roping skills turning into deadly weapons as they dragged men from their saddles. The Tonkawa warriors fought with traditional weapons and modern rifles, their war cries echoing across the desert. Sergeant Santos, his shoulder bandaged but his spirit unbroken, led a group of soldiers who fought with the disciplined volleys of trained cavalry, each shot dropping a target. The battle raged for less than an hour, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, seeing their leaders dead or fleeing, the Comancheros broke. Morrison lay dead in the dust, 3 bullets in his chest. El Escorpión had been captured, along with 30 other raiders. The rest scattered to the 4 winds, their alliance shattered. The casualties were heavy. Fort Stockton lost 23 men. The ranchers and volunteers lost 18 more. The Tonkawa lost 7 warriors. But they had held. As the survivors gathered their dead and tended their wounded, something remarkable happened. The barriers that had divided them seemed less important. Now, they had shed blood together, saved each other's lives, stood shoulder to shoulder against chaos and lawlessness. Captain Caldwell watched as Sergeant Santos helped a wounded Confederate veteran into the infirmary, as Tonkawa warriors shared water with Anglo ranchers, as Don Alejandro's men sang soft songs for the dying, regardless of who they were. Running Wolf approached Caldwell one last time before his warriors departed. "The frontier is changing, Captain. Maybe this is how it should change, not by the government in Washington or Mexico City, but by men of honor standing together against those without honor." "I hope you're right, Chief. History will remember this battle for many reasons, but I will remember it as the day we stopped seeing enemies and started seeing brothers." As the Tonkawa rode away, Caldwell looked at the battered fort, the makeshift cemetery, and the exhausted men who'd become a community. The frontier was indeed changing. And maybe, just maybe, it was changing for the better.